Somewhere in the dark waters off Venezuela's coast, two U.S. military helicopters descended on a giant tanker in the pre-dawn hours of December 11th, 2025. Armed operators in camouflage slid down ropes onto the deck of a ship that had just loaded nearly 2 million barrels of sanctioned crude. Within minutes, the vessel was no longer under the control of its crew or its flag state. Washington had crossed a new line. President Donald Trump announced on Wednesday that the United States had taken possession of a very large crude carrier off the Venezuelan coast, describing it as one of the biggest tankers ever seized in such an operation. He indicated that the oil aboard would likely remain in American hands and hinted that additional actions were already in motion. The operation involved the FBI, Department of Homeland Security, Coast Guard, and direct military support executing what authorities termed a seizure warrant, targeting a vessel engaged in transporting sanctioned Venezuelan and Iranian oil. U.S. Attorney General Pam Bondi released a short video on X showing the nighttime raid. Two helicopters closing in on the tanker, floodlights cutting through the darkness, and operators fast roping onto the deck. The footage lasted only 45 seconds, but carried an unmistakable message of capability and resolve. Maritime intelligence identified the vessel as the VLCC Skipper, a 320,000 deadweight-ton supertanker previously known as Odessa, when it had been sanctioned for moving Iranian crude. The Skipper had departed Venezuela's Jose terminal between December 4th and 5th after loading approximately 1.8 million barrels of Marais heavy crude, one of the densest and most sulfur-rich grades produced in the Orinoco Belt. Satellite imagery and internal PDVSA documents later revealed that roughly 200,000 barrels had been transferred ship to ship near Curacao to the smaller Panama-flagged Neptune 6, which was en route to Cuba, before the U.S. intervention halted the voyage. The tanker had been sailing under a false Guyanese flag, a common practice in the shadow fleet that moves sanctioned oil from Venezuela, Iran, and Russia. Guyana's Maritime Authority quickly disavowed any connection. Between 2021 and 2022, the same vessel had regularly delivered Venezuelan barrels to refineries in Malaysia and China, often disappearing from automatic identification systems for weeks at a time in what trackers call dark activity. Caracas responded within hours, labeling the operation an act of international piracy and blatant theft of national resources. The Venezuelan Foreign Ministry promised to bring the case before the United Nations, the International Court of Justice, and the community of Latin American and Caribbean states. Iran's embassy in Caracas issued its own condemnation the following day, calling the seizure a grave violation of maritime law and international norms. President Nicolas Maduro, speaking at a government-organized march in the capital, avoided direct mention of the incident, but repeated long-standing accusations that Washington was orchestrating a campaign to seize Venezuela's oil wealth, the largest proven crude reserves on the planet at an estimated 303 billion recoverable barrels, according to OPEC figures. Oil traders reacted instantly. Brent crude, which had been drifting lower in Asian hours, reversed course and closed up 27 cents at $62.21 per barrel. West Texas Intermediate followed suit, gaining 21 cents to settle at $58.46. Although the physical loss of 1.6 million barrels remaining aboard the Skipper represented less than 2 days of global consumption, the psychological impact was immediate. The United States had moved from sanctioning and fining to physically interdicting sanctioned cargoes for the first time since broad oil sanctions were imposed on PDVSA in January 2019. Analysts noted that Venezuela managed to export just over 900,000 barrels per day in November 2025, the third highest monthly figure of the year, achieved only by importing record volumes of naphtha and other diluents to blend with its extra-heavy Orinoco crude. Most of those exports were sold at steep discounts to Chinese trading firms that rebrand the oil before onward sale to independent teapot refineries in Shandong province. The tanker seizure marked a sharp escalation from the policy of the first Trump administration, which had imposed crushing financial and oil sanctions, but stopped short of physical interference with cargoes already afloat. The Biden interregnum had seen a brief licensing window in 2022 to 2023 that allowed Chevron to resume limited operations and export Venezuelan crude to the United States under strict conditions. That license was renewed and expanded in late 2025 after the Trump transition team signaled it would tolerate Chevron's presence so long as revenues did not directly fund the Maduro government. Chevron confirmed on Wednesday that its joint venture production of roughly 200,000 barrels per day and its role as the sole conduit for Venezuelan crude entering the U.S. market remained unaffected. The company shipped 150,000 barrels per day to the United States in November, up from 128,000 barrels per day the previous month, almost entirely to its own refineries on the Gulf Coast, capable of processing heavy sour grades. The seizure occurred against the backdrop of an unprecedented U.S. military buildup in the Caribbean and Eastern Pacific. Since early September 2025, American forces had conducted more than 20 lethal strikes on suspected narco vessels, resulting in over 80 fatalities. Legal scholars and some congressional Democrats questioned whether these operations complied with international law, noting that little evidence had been made public proving the targeted boats were actually carrying narcotics or that non-lethal interdiction was impossible. A December Reuters/Ipsos poll found that a majority of Americans, including roughly one-fifth of self-identified Trump supporters, opposed the campaign of deadly strikes on small craft. Reports that one operation involved a follow-up strike on survivors in the water had intensified criticism. A sweeping foreign policy document released by the administration the previous week declared that reasserting dominance in the Western Hemisphere would be a centerpiece of the second Trump term. Venezuela, with its collapsing state oil company, chronic shortages, and strategic location astride Caribbean shipping lanes, had long been identified as a primary target. By physically taking a tanker rather than simply fining banks or insurers, Washington sent a message not only to Caracas, but to the entire shadow fleet that has kept Venezuelan and Iranian oil flowing despite years of maximum pressure sanctions. Russia, which now supplies roughly 40% of Europe's seaborne diesel through similar sanction evasion networks, was undoubtedly watching closely. The fate of the 1.6 million barrels still aboard the Skipper remained unclear. Under U.S. forfeiture law, sanctioned property can be seized and sold, with proceeds typically directed to the Treasury or, in some cases, used to compensate victims of the sanctioned entity. Past seizures of Iranian fuel by the Justice Department in 2020 to 2021 resulted in public auctions on the Gulf Coast, though never on this scale. Industry sources speculated that the cargo could eventually be sold to American refiners capable of processing Mary's 16-degree API gravity and 2.8% sulfur content. The discount Venezuela had been forced to offer Chinese buyers, sometimes $15 to $20 below Brent, suggested the U.S. government could realize a significant windfall if it chose to liquidate the cargo commercially. Cuba, which had been expecting the 200,000-barrel lightering parcel now presumably lost, faced immediate fuel rationing risks. Havana relies on Venezuela for roughly 55,000 barrels per day under a subsidized arrangement dating to the Chavez era, a lifeline that has shrunk dramatically as PDVSA's production fell from 3.3 million barrels per day in the early 2000s to barely 800,000 barrels per day today. Guyana, already in a heated border dispute with Venezuela over the oil-rich Essequibo region, found itself dragged into the controversy simply because the Skipper had been falsely flying its flag, a practice that exposes small registries to diplomatic pressure. For more than 6 years, U.S. policy had sought to choke off revenue to the Maduro government while avoiding actions that could trigger a massive refugee surge or direct military confrontation. The tanker seizure suggested that calculus had changed. With PDVSA's cash flow increasingly dependent on a shrinking circle of sanction-evading traders willing to pay in cryptocurrency, food, or gold, Washington appeared ready to squeeze the physical supply chain itself. Whether this marked the opening move in a broader campaign, perhaps including secondary sanctions on Chinese entities or further interdictions at sea, remained the question hanging over trading floors and chancelleries alike. One thing, however, was certain on a quiet December morning off the coast of Venezuela: the rules of the sanctions game had shifted decisively, and the world's most sanctioned oil exporter now faced a far more direct American challenge than at any time since the crisis began in 2019.